In 1918, on the 24th of April at Villers-Bretonneux, 2 Australian brigades attacked the Germans who had taken the town that morning. That action was to be every bit as daring and dramatic as the action 3 years earlier to the day when the Anzacs stormed ashore on the beach near the Dardanelles. It could be called our other Anzac Day because it set the tone for successes that were to follow that year. From Anzac Day 1918, the Australians were in the spearhead of the attack right across the Somme, and finally victory on the 11th of November following the breaching of the Hindenburg Line at Montbreham. The last Australian action was on the 5th of October 1918 at Montbreham. As the 5th Division left the line for the last time, Captain Ellis, the historian of the 5th Division, wrote in his diary, "Troops more fatigued did rarely be seen, and yet, by sheer determination, they overcame the weakness in the body and marched back in excellent order. But their strained, pallid faces revealed what they had passed through, and numerous transport units along the road, respectfully and in silence, pulled their vehicles to the side so that war-worn men might have not an extra step to march. It was mute and eloquent of brave men to heroes." Retired Colonels Graham Fleeton and Paul Murphy had been taking groups of Australians to the Western Front for many years, and they decided that it was time to finally have an Anzac Day Dawn Service at Villers-Bretonneux. And that first ever dawn service should be conducted on the 90th anniversary to the day that the Australians pushed the Germans off the plateau above Villers-Bretonneux. Once the decision was made, they devoted 2 years to the planning of the tour detail to ensure success. Over that period, many meetings were held with Australian government ministers and staff, and finally, due to Graham and Paul's determination, the government advised them that they would conduct the first ever Anzac Day Dawn Service at the Australian Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux on the 90th anniversary to the day of that special action. The colonels were not the only people who were pleased with the government's decision. There were many others who were delighted that those actions and the sacrifice on the Western Front was finally to have an official Anzac Day Dawn Service. There had been dawn services in the past at the Australian Embassy in Paris, but none at the Australian Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. The rest is history. The Anzac Day Dawn Service, held on the 25th of April 2008, was a memorable and successful event. Now follow the Our Other Anzac Day tour through the planning, the historian's reconnaissance, and finally be on tour with us as we follow the Australians who travelled over to pay their respects to those who were left behind in 1918.
The Our Other Anzac Day tour was now in place. The Australian government was running the first ever dawn service, and the people on the tour were going to participate in that. There was more to it than that. Why are we going there? We're going there to pay our respects to those who have passed away over there. So why are we filming here at Rookwood? Many of us have travelled over the years to the Western Front, to Gallipoli, to all of the other Commonwealth War graves where our people are buried. The problem is here at Rookwood Cemetery in Sydney is there are many people who came back and they were wounded, they were invalided back home, and they passed away fairly quickly. I'm standing next to the grave of one of those men who actually died in October 1918 in Australia. Now, he was obviously repatriated back as a wounded person. There was 265,000 casualties in that action. Many of them came home, of course. We had 62,000 who we left behind, and the rest we brought home. A lot of them here are in Rookwood. They're not in a military cemetery. They are spread through the cemeteries of Australia. We thought it most fitting that we come here, let them know that we are still thinking of them, and we are going over there and we will be back. The period just after the First World War must have been quite horrendous for some, and I'll now read you a passage out of a famous Australian book. There were many damaged and broken men who did return home, and this is a passage in George Johnson's book, My Brother Jack. It gives small insight to the period when Johnson writes about his assessment of those veterans when he says, "Our sister Jean, who was the eldest of us 4 children, eventually married a returned soldier who had had a leg amputated, and this seemed quite normal and expected. Jack and I must have spent a good part of our boyhood in the fixed belief that grown-up men who were complete were pretty rare beings. Complete, that is, in that they had their hearing, their sight, and all their limbs. Well, we knew they existed, but they seldom came our way." The graves overseas are being looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as they are here in Australia. This is an old area of Rookwood Cemetery, and we would hope that these men are never forgotten, as those overseas are not forgotten by our continued visits. When we come back from France, we will come back to Rookwood and we will pay these men a visit just to let them know that we've been over, we've seen their comrades over there, and we've returned here to them. Why do we go overseas? Why do our people go and visit the graves where they're strangers' graves? They're not part of their family, they're no connection whatsoever. But we do go, and we go in our thousands. I was over in France recently and I saw an inscription on a grave, and I would say that this is the reason why we go. And that inscription says, "Oh, why are we dead, we youth? All ye that pass by, forget not." And I hope we don't forget. We do say, lest we forget. Let's make sure that we never do, and continue our pilgrimage overseas and here to Rookwood, and like many cemeteries all through Australia.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're standing on the battlefield of Fleeton, and this has particular significance for Australia on the Western Front, because it was here on the 19th of July 1916 that the first large battle in which Australian troops participated took place. Over to my right over here is a small cemetery called VC Corner Cemetery. It's called VC Corner because here in 1914, in the initial German attack, there were a significant number of combat operations took place, and a number of British VCs were won. However, that particular cemetery is significant because it's the only all-Australian cemetery in France. There are no headstones though, because the soldiers interred there are casualties from the battle I'm about to describe, and they are all unidentified. And in 1916 it was known as the nursery because the area had quietened down, and the British and Commonwealth forces used this as an environment in which troops new to the front could familiarise themselves with the conduct of operations in this part of the world. So our guys had come here from Gallipoli. They were shipped over in about April of 1916. They landed at Marseille in the south of France and then were shipped up here by train. They all remarked about how green the place was compared to where they'd been and of course where they'd come from in Australia. The other point about this area is, as you can see, it's flat, and you'll notice there's drainage ditches everywhere. It gets very muddy and boggy here very quickly, and it's easily inundated by water. So much so that they didn't actually have trench lines here. They used to build up what were called breastworks. So if you can imagine big earthworks reinforced with timber behind which the troops would be sheltered. In July 1916, the 5th Division moved into the area here. VC Corner is indicative of where their front line was, and it extended from about the area of that farmhouse you see over there with the big tall trees behind them, through here, across where I'm indicating now, past that big copse of trees. To give you an idea of what we're talking about 12,000 men. The 5th Division comprised 3 brigades and each of those had 4 battalions in them, and a battalion was about 1,000 men. It was an old farmhouse which had been fortified. That position was called the Sugarloaf, and it's significant because it was the anchor, if you like, of the German defensive position in this area. At this time, the Allies were about to embark on a big offensive down south, the famous Somme offensive, which commenced on the 1st of July. And in order to try and hold the German forces here, it was decided that they'd put on an attack, basically. And the idea was to convince the Germans that the British believed that this area was of such significance that they needed to continue to garrison it. And they originally intended to attack on the 17th of July. But at that time of the year, this area gets a lot of early morning mist, and it made observation on the battlefield very difficult. So what they ended up doing was postponing it, and the Germans became quickly aware that there had in fact been an attack in preparation, because they could see back for miles here and see the troops all bringing up supplies, all the stores they needed, and so on. And in fact, when the attack was postponed, the following day on the 18th, the Germans, the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division, which was over here, held up a sign, "You're late." Now, given the fact that their job was just to hold the Germans here, they could have, at that point they'd succeeded, because the Germans knew an attack was coming in, and so they're not going to go anywhere. But nevertheless, having made all this preparation, they were going to continue with the attack. Now, at this stage of the war, planning and coordination and so on was not good, and this was unfortunately to become a classic example of the way not to conduct military operations on this scale. The attack was preceded by artillery preparation to shell the German positions, and it went in on the evening of the 19th of July. Now, what you need to imagine is in each of these brigade areas, as I mentioned, the 15th, the 14th and the 8th, rows of men standing up. They didn't actually come over the top in the conventional manner that you associate with trench warfare. Because they were behind these raised breastworks, they had to come out through sally ports, through gaps in the walls. The 15th Brigade didn't even get across to the lines of the Germans. Here, where we're standing now, the Australian soldiers did get into the German positions, and as far forward as where those cows are standing over there. Battle, what I'd like to do is read you an extract of a book written by a soldier who was served here on that day. He was located in one of the reserve battalions that wasn't committed to the initial attack. And he's standing there with his colleagues, and his mates in the other battalions stand up, and away they go. Scores of stammering German machine guns spluttered violently, drowning the noise of the cannonade. The air was thick with bullets, swishing in a flat lattice of death. There were gaps in the lines of men, wide ones, small ones. The survivors spread out across the front, keeping the line straight, advancing into the German position. There was no hesitation, no recoil, no dropping of the unwounded into shell holes. The bullets skimmed low from knee to groin, riddling the tumbling bodies before they touched the ground. Still the line kept on. Hundreds were mown down in the flicker of an eyelid, like great rows of teeth knocked from a comb. But still the line went on, thinning and stretching. Here one man alone, there 2 or 3, walking, unhurrying, with the mien of kings, rifles at the high port and tipped with the foot of steel that carries the spirit of an army. Heads high, that few to meet the death they scorned. No fury of battle, but a determined calm bore them forward. Theirs was an unquestioning self-sacrifice that held back nothing. They died, all but 1 or 2 who walked through the fire by a miracle. 56 remained of the full 1,000. It was over in 5 minutes. The 8th and 14th Brigades were able to get into the German lines here and captured the forward trenches and some of the communication trenches behind them. But because they had not been able to capture this fortified position out here, they then became subjected to fire from it. And over the next couple of hours, the Germans were able to position counterattack forces, and during the course of the night that followed, that's what happened. These guys got cut off, and bit by bit, they were, as I said, cut off from behind. They had to fight their way back out again. Now, by this stage, The Australians had suffered something like 5,000 casualties. Now, to put that in some kind of perspective, this has happened in less than 24 hours, and the numbers of dead were a quarter of those sustained in total at Gallipoli in 9 months. Over on the right, the British 61st Division weren't able to gain their objective. They tried to reorganise another attack, and they committed the 3rd Battalion of the 15th Brigade to that. They barely got out of their breastworks, and the same thing happened to them. And in fact, that area out there, you can walk out there now and you'll still find the detritus of battle. Cartridge cases, buttons, sometimes even fragments of bone. So this whole frontal area here was just a sea of wounded and dead. By the morning, the only option they had left was to try and fight their way back out to get back to their lines, which were only a couple of 100 metres over there, but all the while they're trying to cross this fire-swept ground. For the next 3 days, the Australians were recovering their wounded. They tried to organise a local truce, but permission was not granted, and so guys had to risk their lives to go out and recover the wounded and dead. And that, indeed, is the subject of the statue that commemorates this spot. And Chaplain Maxted, who was the padre of one of the battalions, was actually shot dead by a sniper while he was trying to minister to the wounded and dying. The man standing in the statue is Sergeant Simon Fraser, and he was one of the men that was involved in the recovery operation. He was a 40-year-old farmer, so not a young man as a soldier, from the 57th Battalion. That indeed is the battalion from which from Walter Downing, the diarist who recorded the scene that I read out earlier. While he was recovering wounded out here, he heard a guy call out, "Don't forget me, Cobber." And in fact, that's the subject of this the statue. It's called the Cobber's statue. Fraser went out, and amongst the others he brought back was that man. As a bit of a footnote to this sad affair, the soldiers that did penetrate the lines actually got, some of them got quite a way in there, and they were cut off, and numbers of them were captured. And also large numbers of them actually were wounded and died behind the German lines. Some indeed were evacuated by the Germans and treated, but died subsequently. They've never been able to account for about 170 of the soldiers, and just recently evidence has been found in a wood nearby. It's called Pheasant Wood. It's believed that the remains of those soldiers and numbers of British soldiers are contained in a mass grave there that was constructed by the Germans. Now there's a dig in the process of being undertaken at the moment to verify that.
This is the memorial to the first Australian tunnelling company. They burrowed tunnels towards the German lines all through here in the First World War. This monument was erected in 1923 and it was still here in World War II. Fighting passed through here after the Normandy invasion. There's a couple of bullet holes still in remembrance basically of all the fighting here.
War's terrible anyway, but I can't personally think of a worse way to fight underground all the time, you know, and you'd blow in your side and you'd have a platoon or company would charge in. There were bayonet fights and rifle fighting, but it was mostly hand-to-hand stuff when they burst in. The idea was that you went down there to protect your mine that you were building so as you could blow the others.
Hills 60 has been left as a memorial to all those who fought and died there.
We're at Polygon Wood to commemorate the attack by the 4th and the 5th Australian Divisions in September 1917. We're actually sitting next to the memorial to the 5th Australian Division. Jeff, you have a bit of a story regarding Polygon Wood.
My father joined the infantry from Mildura, Victoria, and then sailed on a troop ship to Egypt and transferred there at Al-Kabir to the artillery. Sailed across the Mediterranean with gun, horses, limber, all the way from Marseille up to Fromelles. To his dying day, he had no regrets, having been a soldier. He had a very clear mind and was not inhibited by anything, and I know a lot about what went on. In fact, this trip has been an opportunity to see the topography of the things I've heard about for so many years.
Yeah, this is the Polygon Wood Cemetery. It's a rare example of a true battlefield cemetery. in most cases were cleared after the war, the bodies taken to concentration cemeteries. But this one has been left here just to show how mates buried their mates.
We would like to hear the story of where you found those bodies and where you dug those bodies up.
Yeah, but actually I didn't find the bodies.
No, but you helped dig them up.
Them because and the day after the farm he called me, he said, "Johan, I think they found some bones." I went straight, he was excavating a body. Just a part of the remains of a body. Just the legs and there's missing the top body. And then weeks later he called me and then I saw 2 skulls.
At Polygon Wood, the historians' chance meeting with Johan van der Vollen, who was the major player in finding the Zonnebeck 5, proved fascinating. The Zonnebeck 5 were the bodies found at Zonnebeck recently, and DNA testing is in the process of establishing their identities.
More as a personal story for latter day is how you guys met. Emailing each other about
sending books across the ocean.
Sending books across the ocean. And here you are, all those years ago, you bump into each other at Polygon Wood. Okay, thanks very much for what you're doing. We all appreciate it. Thank you.
Enjoy the holiday.
And thank you. And we're going down to have a beer at your place.
Oh, you will pay me one?
We will.
You will.
Neville? Neville will pay you. Okay.
I met a man from Belgium over the email some years ago. We struck up a great friendship talking about all the fighting that happened in here in World War I. It's my very great pleasure to meet Johan van der Vollen.
That's a very good meeting that I had a couple last week with Nigel. I got emails, yeah, years ago. I bought his books and there was one book that I don't have. This one. I will buy his book.
No, you won't buy it.
No.
In Australia, they started to dig in the archives and they came up with a list of about 12 names. Those names were given to the public in Australia through the newspapers, through the television, and with the question, would any descendants of those 12 come forward? I handle about 35 skeletons a year, but this was a very emotional moment, even for me.
The beauty of this spot for us really is we're on the end of the Messines Ridge and we can actually have a look. The New Zealanders actually took this position, that's why the New Zealand Memorial's there, of course. Our own supporting division came across the flat area. Forming up place really was back behind this ridge, and if you read through you'll find that when they were formed up they did get a bit of artillery hit, took them, but not a great deal. This was a success. There are many divisions involved in this right up the ridge, and it was a huge attack, and the Germans didn't leave the trenches. Even though they were being overrun, they didn't leave them. Our guys actually had to bomb them out of the trenches. And once you get into those sort of actions, you do take more casualties.
And one of the things that one of the mistakes that the Germans made in this was that, in actual fact, when the assault was going in, they were doing a relief in place, and they relieved the divisions that were originally here, which were trained to counter-attack. They relieved them and brought in untrained divisions, and that further compounded their problems.
Prowse Hill Cemetery, located above Claude Street Wood in Belgium. The cemetery was named after Brigadier General Charles Bertie Prowse, DSO, who is buried here. This is very close to the area where the Christmas truce of 1914 started. Brugstrode Wood is large and over the period of the war probably sheltered 1 million soldiers among the trees. Toronto Cemetery is really an Australian cemetery. All 78 soldiers buried here are Australian. All were members of the 9th Brigade, and 3 of the soldiers were only 18 years old. The most senior is Captain F.J. Piggott of the 36th Battalion. This is the restaurant strip in Amiens on the bank of the Somme.
Down here you will most probably see where there's a couple of the canals that actually flow under this part of the city. And a lot of these places are now getting little shops starting in them, and this is a university town. The university is just down the road here, 100 metres, and there's a lot of these little cottage industries that are starting up, and they're starting up about here. We'll move through this here and I'll take you further on.
The cathedral is larger than the Notre Dame in Paris.
What you need to do is...
As our tour was to have a free night in Amiens, a reconnaissance and briefing for our staff was conducted by Colonel Murphy.
That's really the crisis part.
Basically, your landmarks from here are the Hamel village, which is in the bottom of this depression to our northeast, Pear Trench, which is the significant area of cleared ground up here that's ploughed. You'll see that the chalk is brought to the surface there. That generally indicated an area where trenches had been dug down into the chalky subsoil. So that's the significant feature of Pear Trench. And round to our left, the rise to our left and the small copse behind it is the location of Kidney Trench. From here, the main line of the German army was the Hamel village itself, through to Pear Trench, back in a bit of a dip and out to Kidney Trench, and then running south through to just east of Villers-Bretonneux. The Australian forces at this stage are beyond the ridge line to our left, the west, and from perhaps the crest of the ridge here where you'll see a small road that slopes down, the Australians were from that position running back along the crest and to the north-south from there. The tanks during this assault were directed by infantry soldiers for the first time. Significant casualties from the action. Australia lost about 1,400, the US 176. The Germans lost over 2,000 casualties and 1,600 prisoners. The plan for this attack called for all the objectives to be secure in 90 minutes. It actually took 93 minutes, and the Battle of the Hamel as such, and the use of coordination of all arms, became a model for all following battles leading to the German surrender.
The church still has remnants of damage from the war on its facade. The bust in the grass verge is the heroine of Péronne, Catherine de Bois, also known as Marie Forêt, La Belle Péronne, who personally broke the standard of Charles' royal flag in the siege of 1536, threw the bearer into the fosse and saved the city. Here we are in Péronne. This is the Péronne of today, but the Péronne of yesteryear was a destroyed mess. The Germans pulled back from Péronne in 1917 back to the Hindenburg line, and when they left they completely destroyed it. But then later on in the March offensive they came back into Péronne, they made it a fortress that it was. But as you can see around the area now, it's been rebuilt. A lot of it's been rebuilt, not like it was, but in a very interesting way. This is Péronne, and the history of Péronne goes back much further than that. Julius Caesar had this as an outpost when he was established in Amiens when he was fighting the Gauls. And here we are now, 2008, 90 years after the Australians retook this for the French. We're here celebrating that ANZAC Day service.
The 4th Division Memorial is located at Bellinglis, the area where the division left the line for the last time. This is as far as they advanced. Following their impressive campaign, it's a fitting place for their memorial.
The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. I might just read the inscription that the family put on the headstone as well. not dead to us, we love him dear, lost but gone before.
This cemetery is located on the Hindenburg line itself, and 305 diggers are buried here together with a British VC winner. And many graves for Chinese Labour Corps casualties. The Chinese Labour Corps provided the workmen who helped maintain the Allied trench system. Reckerville Canal was built by Napoleon and was part of the Hindenburg Line in World War I. The Germans kept a division in the tunnel as a reserve, but when the Australians and American forces took the position, the Australian engineers were able to deactivate all explosive devices within the tunnel, which is now part of the canal system in France.
Well, we're here in the High Tree Cemetery, which is on the hill just above Montbretagne. This is as far as Australian soldiers came in the Great War. And a soldier here at the very end of the line of graves died on the day that the Australian forces were taken out of the line, on the 5th of October 1918. His name is J.H. Taylor, 3656 of the 2nd Australian Pioneers, fighting as infantry at the time. There are 4 Australians buried in this grave, in this cemetery, and a couple of them were also of the Pioneers but were unnamed, known to God. Let's just remember Private J.H. Taylor. God will swallow up death forever. The Sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove the disgrace of his people from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. Isaiah.
Fired on the wheelbarrow. Et tout militaire cimetière, ouais. C'était snipers et là-bas. Ouais. Ouais.
Mont St Quentin was the scene of a wonderful victory by the 2nd Division, which was called the finest feat of the war by General Rawlinson. The division selected Mont St Quentin as the location for its memorial. During the Second World War, the Germans were affronted by the digger and his dying eagle and destroyed the statue. However, a new and splendid memorial was erected in 1971 of an outsized bronze figure of a digger, and it's one of the finest memorials on the Western Front.
This is Hem Farm Cemetery. This cemetery is located between Perone and Albert, and it was a lot of the graves here are in 2 phases. The first phase in the 1916 battles, but also the August and September and October battles of 1918. There's 2 VCs in this cemetery, one an Australian, Robert McTeer from the 23rd Battalion, and Robert won his VC for some gallant work on Mont St Quentin. Now Mont St Quentin is I'm pointing at Mont St Quentin now, it's about 4 kilometres away, and that was the magnificent battle from the 2nd Division which took Mont St Quentin and opened up the Perone salient that was supposed to be a fortress, but the 2nd Division took that in a very short time. There's 131 Australians with known graves here and 7 unknown, but also in here it's very sad indeed, as all the graves are. There are many people many soldiers from the regiments of South Africa. The 1st Regiment South African Infantry, there's many here and they have no names on the headstones. Our thoughts must go out to the Commonwealth War Graves people who keep these cemeteries in such fine condition. The flowers In another month's time, when the spring hits this area, it is going to be quite pretty for their visitors. Thank you.
Well, we're looking at a grave of a soldier who went off to the First World War with the Australian 5th Battalion as a sergeant and was commissioned into the British Army as a temporary lieutenant into the Service Corps. His name is Thomas Noel Heath Stretch, known as Noel to his family. The reason that we've got a number of people by his grave is that the people that we see on camera are all of the University of New South Wales Regiment, which found itself having the honour of receiving Noel's sword from a relative some 90 years after Noel died. Noel Heath was awarded the Military Cross in the Third Battle of Ypres in Western Flanders in July 1917, and again another MC in September 1917. So he's an MC in Bar. Sadly, he was shot by a sniper in March 1918 during the German offensive, and now rests here. The regiment, that is the University of New South Wales Regiment, came by Noel Heath's sword about 4 years ago via the Australian High Commission in London, which sent it to the Royal Military College Duntroon. The college, knowing that Noel was the son of the Anglican Bishop of Newcastle, decided to have Noel's sword as a sword of honour for the top staff cadet of the University of New South Wales Regiment. The reason for that was that Newcastle, of course, has a subunit of the University of New South Wales Regiment known as UN Company. And the sword has been awarded for the last 3 years and has become quite a tradition. So we're very honoured to be here to pay respect to this man.
On the 1st of July 1916, the Battle of the Somme commenced with 19 mine explosions. One such mine exploded to leave the Lochnaga crater. It is 200 metres in diameter and 30 metres in depth, and the members of the St George's Cathedral Choir were very impressed with the size of the hole and the history of the area. In 1979, an Englishman, Richard Dunning, bought the site to save it from being ploughed under as farmland. The 1st Division chose Pozières as the site for its memorial, for it was here that the division had almost 8,000 casualties in a 6-week period. That action cost the division more lives than any other in the war. This is the site of Albert Jacker's VC stunt, which should have earned him a second VC, but did not. But he was awarded an MC for this action. The old windmill stood on this site and was captured on August the 4th, 1916 by Australians who fell more thickly on this ridge than any other battlefield of the war.
Some of these boys were 17 and 18 years old, and also some were 44. And they're all ages. Australia had 470,000 people in uniform in World War I. We had a population of 4.5 million. The Germans were mostly in a defensive position right through the war. They were defending, we were attacking.
After being taken through aspects of the battle for Pozières, the choir from St George's Cathedral visited the British Memorial at Thiepval with its 73,412 names of those who fell in the Somme and who have no known grave.
Got that in something else.
It says here, placed here by his officers, NCOs and men.
At Dernicourt, this grave of the senior Australian officer buried here, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Lean, commanding officer of the 28th Battalion and a member of the famous Lean military family. His men thought so highly of him that they paid to have this marble slab erected over his grave. This is the ground where the Australian 4th Division stopped the German advance on Amiens in April 1918. After losing ground, the remnants of the 45th, 46th and 48th Battalions under Colonel J.S. Denton made one of the finest counterattacks ever carried out by Australian troops, with massive fire support, almost 28,000 shells fired by Australian artillery.
They were at the start line. The assault was then postponed for 24 hours, but in the meantime it had snowed and the soldiers, the assaulting battalions, were laying out in the snow waiting for the word to go. They then had to get up and turn around and march back into the defended areas. And most of them were thoroughly exhausted at this stage. In fact, one bloke quoted as saying, "We dragged ourselves back. My rifle butt was dragging in the snow. I was carrying it by the sling. I was totally exhausted. Of what use would I be to assault again tomorrow?" And yet, in fact, the assault did go ahead again the next day. The things that happened here were the tanks didn't arrive, the wire wasn't cut, the whole battle relied on a new and untried piece of technology, the tanks.
We're in Villers-Bretonneux. We're actually in the Adelaide Cemetery at Villers-Bretonneux, and this is the cemetery that was selected to take the remains of the unknown soldier back to Australia on the 2nd of November 93, 75 years after the bones were laid to rest here. The remains of this soldier representing all of those who have an unknown grave lie at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra.
This is the grave of Private C. Harrison, a young 17-year-old Western Australian killed in the bayonet charge at Villers-Bretonneux. This is for his family.
Peter Godfrey was one of my former platoon commanders, and during discussions we established that a common link through the 12th 40th Battalion, that Peter's great uncle was one Percy Clyde Statton, who won his VC within this area, this very spot almost. So I'll ask Peter to talk about that particular event.
Percy Clyde Statton was a member of the 40th Battalion, which is a Tasmanian battalion. Prior to this action, he was awarded a military medal and he was gassed at Villers-Bretonneux. The final objective was just beyond the village of Pro-Yart, which is just over there. The 40th Battalion was tasked to clear the village of Pro-Yart, which they did without too much trouble. But as soon as they moved, supported by a battalion to the left and a battalion to the right, the battalions to both left and right came under machine gun fire from a position that we can only guess but is not very far from this location. Percy had previously located 2 Lewis guns on the extremities of the village, and they began to engage 6 German machine gun posts. Percy, with 2 other soldiers, armed with a revolver, came up the road here to your front and used the protection of the edges of the road there to move towards the German machine gun posts. He relieved the German of his rifle and bayoneted him with his own rifle. For that action, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Now, in typical Tasmanian fashion, we'll do this with a bit of couth and culture.
Isn't it Madeira?
Yeah, that's where it comes
Madeira.
from.
They used to
Now, Peter, was this a port that you brought all the way from Australia for this special occasion?
No, the local supermarket at Perrone. Bring up, boys. Gentlemen, to Percy Clyde Staton, VCMM.
Yes, we have a small group of us have come up from Paris all the way to Rouen to the Saint Sever Cemetery extension. Saint Sever, after Tyncott, Lissenhock and Quent Road, this cemetery holds more Australians than any other. 783 of them, of a total of 8,293 British and Dominion burials. Rouen, an old cathedral city on the Seine River, was a great wartime base. British camps and hospitals were south of the river on the southern outskirts of the city. The hospitals at Rouen remained there almost the whole of the campaign. Today we have Loris Knight with us, and Loris is visiting the grave of Gunner J.J. Burrows of the Royal Garrison Artillery. He died on the 21st of December 1917.
They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end, against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall not grow old,
as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them,
nor the years
contempt. And the going down of the sun, and in the morning we will remember them.
They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, sure of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end.
It's seldom that you go to a cemetery where you see Australian women that are buried. We have two in this cemetery. We have Louisa Wriggle, who was an Australian Red Cross worker. Louisa, on the bottom of her headstone is, during the Great War, she gave her life for sick and wounded. Louisa did too. Louisa was a Victorian. She died of a hemorrhage, probably cerebral, on the 31st of August 1918. The second Australian woman buried here at the cemetery at Rouen is Hilda Mary Knox. Hilda was an Australian Army nursing sister, and she died on the 17th of February 1917 from an unspecified disease, possibly influenza. She was the daughter of James and Illabella Knox of Benalla, Victoria, and she was 33 years old when she died. We should never forget them. Standing in a canola field, which is in Villers, just outside Albert, and this is the Roman road, one of the Roman roads that Julius Caesar pushed out of Amiens. And Amiens itself was a major centre for Julius Caesar, and he built a couple of roads, and they're all straight, and they're called Roman roads no matter where you are. One goes up through Albert to Beaupalm, the other one goes out to St Quentin, and the third one heads towards the coast. Standing here in the canola fields, listening to the birds, it's hard to imagine, isn't it, that 90 years ago this was all asunder with guns. The gun lines were about a kilometre or so to my right, and they were over the ridge, and they were dropping the shells on Pozieres, which is to my left, in support of the Australian attack on Pozieres. It's just hard to believe that this area, which is so beautiful today, could be so dreadful then.
His name was Lionel Roy Lucan, and he was known as Dick, and Grandad Dick was named after him, my dad.
The Beacon Cemetery at Sally Lorette is named from the brick beacon on the summit of the ridge above the north side of the Somme River. James McConnell, who at the age of 48 was one of the oldest Australians engaged in frontline fighting.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
We will remember them.
The Australian Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux with the Cross of Remembrance and the 35-metre high tower. There are 779 Australians buried here, and the memorial wall has the names of nearly 11,000 Australians who fell in France and who have no known grave. Major Gary George briefed our team on the ANZAC Day program to ensure that our visit would be incident-free. The view from the tower shows the expanse of the cemetery. Within the tower, directions to other sites are displayed. Jeff Rose points out the bullet holes that were caused by enemy aircraft in World War II. Rehearsals for the Dawn Service were conducted at the site the day before ANZAC Day. ANZAC Day commenced with the arrival of our people in the early hours of that special day.
But I tell you what, it's not as cold here as Gallipoli.
I know.
It was freezing last
Garden
year.
Hills, eh?
Yeah.
It's high up. I've heard about it, I haven't been there.
Yeah, but I tell you what, the bloody hills there, you know, they all seem to be made out of concrete. I know they even made sort of trenches in that sense, you know. It was incredible. But we had a good time.
That's terrific.
I'm 92 now.
92. I'm just going to film you a little bit.
Yeah.
That better?
It's wonderful that you made the effort to come out here.
I was at Gallipoli last year and I thought I'd do the right whole lot and get here.
Yes.
Try this out. Wonderful.
Work that Greg and his whole family have put into preparing these uniforms, the organising of them through from India, and the dramas of getting them across here and getting all the bits and pieces. His wife and mum were sewing vigorously to put all the patches and so on and get them all prepared for the cadets, and liaison with the cadets in Newcastle. So he's put a lot of work into, I think, what is going to be a fairly key part of tonight's celebration.
I've served in the Army Reserve for 30 years. That's the first opportunity I've had to come to Villers-Bretonneux. So I thought it was appropriate when this tour is on that I take the opportunity. And it has been something really special.
feel for his people, for his May. I wonder why such good men suffer. This is the third of my best mates I've lately lost. After the war, the Australian commanders agreed that this hill should be the place where the Australian Corps was commemorated. As Director of the Office of Australian War Graves, I would like to welcome you to this special dawn service. Welcome you on behalf of the Australian Government. Welcome you on behalf of the local communities who through their annual services have marked ANZAC Day in this region down the years.
On behalf of the Government and people of Australia, it is my privilege to welcome you to this special ANZAC Day Dawn Service.
O God of all mercies and comfort, who is the source of peace, we remember and honour those who fought and died here in this place.
Following the dawn service, our other ANZAC Day tour moved to the Victoria School in Villers-Bretonneux for breakfast, where gifts were presented to the school.
l'école Victoria. Vous devez savoir que cette école a une histoire un peu particulière puisque c'est sur des fonds australiens qu'elle a pu être construite.
So I try to translate what the head teacher said. You're all really very, very welcome here. We try to keep this consciousness even if they are young and they are aware of all the links between the countries.
Nous tenons donc spécialement à vous remercier tous de votre présence ce matin, de vos visites régulières à Villers-Bretonneux. Villers-Bretonneux et l'Australie sont définitivement liés. Et nous vous souhaitons vraiment un très 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 bon séjour ici dans notre commune. Voilà, au revoir.
So Mr. Thomas is thanking everybody. The event is so tremendous that everybody here I think is very happy. Most of the children were at the memorial today in the evening. We just want you to listen to them.
Belong to these. The owner of this particular mug fought in Villers on ANZAC Day in 1918, and we've decided to bring the mug back to Villers and to present it to the museum. Thank you very much indeed.
Et je remercie beaucoup de ce don qui est assez exceptionnel. Merci à tout le monde.
Breakfast was followed by a march through the town where the Minister for Veteran Affairs, Alan Griffin, received the salute before addressing the parade.
I am sorry, but I don't speak French. I speak English. I am sorry. But another year, I speak French. You speak English.
This morning we remembered those who had come before us, those who had suffered, those who had died. And as those of us who have come from Australia, and that's many of those who are here today, we know that with ANZAC Day, we spend the morning remembering, and I suppose we spend the afternoon moving on to enjoying ourselves, watching the footy, having a few beers, and joining in the camaraderie of what's involved past the conflict. This is not the first time Australians have marched through this town, and I'm confident after today it won't be the last. And to be here and to share this with you, and to share it with our French friends on such an occasion, I think really does show the community between our two nations and the relationships and the ties that bind that were so on evidence out at the memorial this morning and again are here today and will again be with the commemorative services tomorrow with the local community. As an Australian and as a representative of the Australian people, I'm very proud to be here on this occasion and to share with our French friends this occasion, a time which is so important to them with respect to what happened 90 years ago and which they've maintained its importance in the years since. And from our point of view, on a day which is for so many reasons to all of us, a day that will always live on. Thank you again for coming. I thank the Mayor for being our host. And I know we'll enjoy the rest of the day in comradeship as those who have come before us also did. Thank you very much.
But I would say that the ANZAC Day Dawn Service now will continue, and this is a start. They really appreciate what the Australians do, the Victoria School and others, and you're most probably aware that we made a donation today from our other ANZAC Day group, donation of €4,000 to the school. Is that right? No, I wasn't aware of that.
My grandfather was Richard Somerset Taylor from Manly, New South Wales. He enlisted in World War I after his older brother was killed at Gallipoli. By the time he enlisted and trained, Gallipoli was over, so he got sent to France with his younger brother. He got injured and was sent back several times as a stretcher bearer. Finally, he made it home in late 1919 and returned back to Australia, where he was given a soldier settlement farm on the Riverina of New South Wales.
Pour enfoncer les lignes ennemies, mais ils ont été forcés de se replier.
Our other ANZAC Day tour conducted its own wreath-laying service at the Digger Memorial in Bullecourt.
Here in April and May 1917, soldiers did their best to break through the enemy lines, but they were forced to withdraw. Since that time, the village of Bullecourt is part of the history of war of Australia.
Greater love has no one than this, that one lays down one's life for another. We come before you, O Lord, remembering those who gave up their freedom, their livelihood, even their life, for their country and for liberty. As we remember them, we thank you for their sacrifice.
They shall not grow old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
As a matter of fact, for a couple of years, Jean Le Taille had that part
in his collection, and he didn't know the meaning. And strangely, a couple of years after, he found that stretcher, and we started to do research about how it was used by the medical corps. I found for him that photos extracted from British books, and well, we kept going the research, and we found that the parts he had in his collection would just fit under
the stretcher.
Yes, under the stretcher. Yes.
And you were telling me that the stretcher is made by Peugeot.
Yes, we had in the French military almost the same kind of stretcher for the French wounded men, and the Peugeot fabric was used to make the same kind. Yes, very strange. So the British and the French had almost the same kind of.
It's interesting to hear these stories, because people talk about most of the stories in the Western Front. They talk about the killing fields, the machine guns, the tanks.
Yes.
But this is a special story in its own.
Yes,
and there's not too many people would have ever seen a stretcher such as this on wheels. And
you have to imagine the bump.
The bump through the battlefields wouldn't help the sick person.
It was better. It was better than nothing, of course.
Yes, it was better than, most probably better than being carried.
Yes, and to put it on display here is also a way for us to remember the bravery of the Royal Medical Corps guys.
That's right. That's right.
They achieve some feat of bravery which are unknown.
Yes.
Still now. Yes. Just
without your support, we would be floundering around in
I am
probably
here
in the
to try
countryside.
to pay the debts I owe toward your countrymen who came twice, because I'm not here to forget those who flew over us in World War II. So I'm just trying to help. Yeah. What I'm doing in France is nothing, comparing what your countrymen have done for my freedom. Nice. So in the past, some of your countrymen said that I am just a fair decam froggy cobber.
Yes. Okay, thanks, Eve. I'm really pleased with it.
No worries, mate.
Thank you.
As they approached the town, the Australians saw the Golden Virgin on the basilica leaning out, head down from the tower. The famous Leaning Virgin had been dislodged in 1915 by German shell fire, and legend was that when the Virgin fell, the war would be over. She crashed to the ground on the 16th of April 1918, but the war went on.
Just a little bit of background here. This is a coal clough, obviously. The other day we called in at a cemetery and a grave, and that was a chap called Percy Salmon. That was my father's mother's brother. He was buried there right at the nearly at the close of the First World War. So on the other side of the family now, we have a chap called Laurie Colclough, and so this was my father's brother. And so he's buried here. And my father's father also fought in the war, and we think he was gassed and copped a bit of shrapnel in about 1917, but he recovered. He went back to England. And the Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up.
We've come to a town, a small village, Roisel, which is east of Perone, and Max Willis is with me here, and Brigadier Max has come along here to have a look at the area where his uncle fought.
My uncle joined the AIF in September 1916 and went straight to England as part of the massive reinforcements at that time, and he fought in this area after finishing training in southern England, and this is the place where he was put out of the war with severe shrapnel wounds. Although his wounds were severe, he survived. The interesting thing from his records was how frequently He and I presume other soldiers were in and out of the line with, minor gassing, dysentery, infections, and they'd go back for a week for treatment and then back into the line, and this kept going on and on and on. But finally, the war ended for him in September.
Something we never discuss is that the actual logistics, when we talk logistics of the First World War, we talk about bringing the ammunition forward, the rations, the transport. What we don't talk about is that movement of men that have to go back for a week with dysentery, come back, find their unit, and back into their unit, back to England for 3 months.
Yeah.
The paperwork and the record keeping must have been tremendous.
But at the same time, when you dig into the archives of the War Memorial, they were very meticulously kept, considering the exigent circumstances.
That's right.
All handwritten.
Yes.
And I have them, and it records every time he was in and out of the line and what for. My uncle was always pretty tight-lipped about the war and his experiences, as most of these men were. But there was one thing he told me once that obviously tore at his heartstrings, and that was that the thing that upset him most were what he called the British Bantam battalions. These were battalions of 12, 13, 14-year-old boys who, when they came under fire, they just couldn't handle it, and they sort of reached for the nearest man they could find and cried in his arms for their mother, and that really upset him.
And how do you feel being in Rossell as the first of the family to be here, and this is where he was and this is where he fought? So you're really walking the ground most probably where he was.
It's very poignant to me because he was my favourite uncle and my mother's favourite brother, and now that I've been here to these battlefields, it's very touching and very emotional as to what these men went through.
It sure is. We're actually at the area where the original chateau was in Roisselle, and Max was saying that his uncle did mention it a few times, and this is all that remains of the chateau now behind us, Max, and it's quite interesting. It was wonderful being inside, taking that photograph of the town's coat of arms against the big fireplace there.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating and gives you a wonderful feeling to look at a building that I know my uncle must have seen, and even in the horror of war, that he was here and he saw that building, and now I'm looking at it.
That's right.
Or what's left of it.
Yeah, this chap, Private Holmes, don't know his first name, I've just discovered him by accident, but his service number and his unit, he was obviously an early enlistee in the 11th Battalion, West Australians. Service number 309 means he's enlisted in August 14, so he's survived Gallipoli, 3 years on the Western Front, and he's been killed in August 1918. And I know there's a few others over here as well that have got 3-digit service numbers, so that's what sort of happens. You've got blokes who have survived virtually all of the war to be killed in the final months.
Well, we came to France to find my great-uncle Wally, Walter Priestley Binning. He was a 22-year-old carpenter from North Fremantle, and he came across here with the 16 Battalion, in fact, and then was promoted to Lance Corporal to the 4th Light Trench Mortar Battery, and he was killed on the 30th of March in 1918, just north of Albert. And so we visited his grave yesterday and left him some lavender from his family home in North Fremantle. It's actually been very emotional to be here, and I didn't realise just how much it would affect me to be here, because the connection is a few generations back.
We're in Hangard Cemetery at the moment, and that's some kilometres south of Villers-Bretonneux, and this is the right flank of the Australian force in those March 1918 battles. Over my left shoulder you can see the small village of Hangard. This cemetery has many Australians in it, but a lot of others as well. We're here with the gravestone of Private Fred Petty. Fred was from the 34th Battalion, which has links to the current Royal New South Wales Regiment, as it was the Illawarra Regiment in those days. Fred came to the Western Front, and when killed he was 42 years old. There's been a reunion in front of the grave of Fred, in as much as his two granddaughters actually were on this tour, and they visited the gravesite, and they've placed a photograph there of the whole family. Fred had 8 children, and his wife was going blind at the particular time when he came, and when she received the letter to say that he was missing, it really made her health go down even further. Outside the Victorian School in Villers-Bretonneux is this memorial plaque dedicated to Lieutenant Colonel Charles Watson, who carried out the reconnaissance prior to the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, and after the war was responsible for the rebuilding of the school. Above this school is the excellent Musée Australien.
When I was going through my father's effects, I found a postcard which was sent to my father for his 4th birthday, and it was postmarked the 23rd of April 1918 from Villers-Bretonneux. My grandfather was killed the day after. It was written in pencil, of course. Yeah. An extraordinary feeling. I saw this postcard and I thought, yes, that's fine. The postcards, and ancient, of course, Villers-Bretonneux was only something in the memory. But when I read it and found that it was probably the last thing that grandfather did to home, it was just a spooky feeling.
Yes. And how did you feel when you came over here, where he wrote it from?
Well, the same really, you know, it was, I think probably the expectation was high and it wasn't disappointed.
I often look at the photos of anything to do with First World War to see if I recognise my father's face. My father was in the First World War, so, and he was a captain, and he fought at Villers-Bretonneux on the 24th and 25th.
Was he in the 15th Brigade?
Yep.
Right, so John took you up there to 60th?
60th
Battalion. 60th,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. And he won a military cross.
Name is Walter Joseph Host. He went to Gallipoli as a 19-year-old. He got wounded in Gallipoli, I think, and went to England, and then came back to the front here, and he won the military medal at Lone Pine, and he was mentioned in dispatches here in France.
His date of death suggests that he was killed on the second day of the attack at Pozieres. He was part of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Brigade and 1st Australian Division, and they were the first formation committed to the attack at Pozieres. The fact that he's here would suggest that he was probably seriously wounded and then evacuated and has died at some point in one of the casualty clearing stations. I'm at the entrance to what is known as the Latreux Aid Post Cemetery, which is a small cemetery located on what was the battlefield where the Battle of Fromelles took place on the 19th of July 1916. Here the Australian 5th Division suffered more than 5,000 casualties in the space of 27 hours. This cemetery, though, contains the previous year. There are 4 Australians here, but their identities are unknown. The other significant aspect about this particular location is just across the road from me was the site of Brigadier Pompey Elliott's headquarters of the 15th Brigade during the Battle of Fromelles.
The famous medieval cloth hall in Ypres was ruin and rubble when the Australians arrived in 1917. The Germans had bombarded the place continuously in 1915, and fire had reduced it still further. After the war, it was rebuilt to the original plans, a place of beauty.
The position I'm standing is approximately that which was the site of the front line of the Allied forces in October 1917. We're near Broodstein Ridge, which is part of the area that was caught up in the Battle of Passchendaele. And the weather around me today is not dissimilar to what the troops would have experienced at the time, and it's easy to see why this place became the hell on earth that it did. This particular site we're at is near a point of some interest. Over behind me is a small copse of trees. That's all that remains of a feature described or known as Celtic wood back in 1917. And the area of Celtic wood was on the 9th of October 1917, the scene of something of a military mystery as far as Australia was concerned. From that day, Lieutenant Frank Scott from the 10th Battalion, a South Australian battalion, went out on a raid into the area of Celtic wood as part of a diversion strategy to distract the Germans from the impending attack on Passchendaele due a couple of days later. Problem for them was the fact that similar raids had been conducted on the 2 previous days by their sister battalions, the 11th and 12th battalions. What happened to Lieutenant Scott and his men has become something of a mystery, and it would appear that some 37 disappeared into Celtic wood, never to be seen again. There's a couple of other sites that we'll link to this, a plaque in the city of Ypres commemorating the raid, and also a grave nearby of one of the soldiers who was actually on the raid. We're here at the Dochy Farm Cemetery just outside Broodstein in Belgium, because this is the location of the grave of one of the few soldiers of the Celtic wood raid whose fate is known. Private Edward Green is buried in this cemetery, although his date of death is incorrectly marked. He, as I said, is one of the few soldiers from the Celtic wood raid who has been positively located.
Unit memorial plaques abound the walls of the church, and the seats have cushions showing units which had served in the salient.
This is one of hundreds of commemorative plaques in St George's Church in Ypres, commemorating those who fell in the Great War. This particular one commemorates Lieutenant Frank Scott and the men of the 10th Battalion who took part in the raid on Celtic wood on the 9th of October 1917.
We're east at Trezeil, just not far from Hazelbrook, and we're here with David and Cheryl Deasy and Warwick Wilkinson. It's quite interesting that we're all here together because in April 1918 it was Warwick's father was actually operating here in his unit, and his unit was just a bit to my left, a little bit further to the west. Not far, maybe half a click or so. And then we way again in July, later on in 1918, we have Cheryl's grandfather who was here and wounded here, but he was here operating. It's quite an interesting position because when you think of the Western Front, you think of the lines of troops dug in trenches. But in this particular instance, they were in what we call goose eggs in the modern day. You had a couple of companies forward and a couple back with the battalion headquarters in the centre.
This is the 3rd Battalion area, Graham. If I can just point out to our direct left, down by that copse of trees, would have been Delta Company, the left forward company. The right forward company was approximately where we see that farmhouse on our right today. It's a distance of about 400 or 500 metres. The rear companies were C Company well behind the farmhouse behind me and down in the entrance to the left.
So they're on a reverse slope.
They're on the reverse slope. Right. In fact, this whole position's a reverse slope. A Company was directly out the back of this road, about 200 or 300 metres down the slope. And battalion headquarters was in the middle, right behind the farmhouse that we have here.
Cheryl, how do you feel standing here on the ground where your grandfather fought?
I'm a bit crying, a bit upset, I think, because he talked to me for 20 years about where he was. Actually, he was quite talkative about the First World War, and I had my 5 great uncles in this area as well, but my grandpop was the most special one, and so to see that sign just made me a little bit sad, to be honest. Yeah.
Did you touch the sign?
No, but I will.
I think we should. We'll touch the sign now.
I will.
The two patrols left the position and crossed the road that you can see here. One patrol of 12 and one patrol of 19, both led by sergeants. There was one officer accompanying the patrols, most probably on a special task, and he and 4 soldiers were wounded on that particular night. Tell me the story.
Well, Dad used to tell the story on the train from the north, going down south, getting straight off the train, just walking across the platform and being put on the train and coming back to where they were. And they didn't think much of the organisation of that, but nevertheless that brought them back up here where the breakthrough was starting to show up.
They weren't to know that Monash had lost his 1st Division at that stage, and they wanted them back up here because Plummer was having really problems with the 5th Army that was collapsing.
That's right, they weren't to know. And when they got up here, Dad tells me, and this was evident on other occasions, when they came back into the villages, the French people said, "Oh, Australian," and they returned back to their homes. And Dad reckons he experienced that. And Dad was coming back, and the fire really came from the enfilading fire came, and Dad was wounded. And Lieutenant Prescott was the in command there of the platoon. Dad stayed out there, in and out of consciousness for about 2 hours, and then a private W.H. Reed from Hornsby, according to the battalion's history, crawled out 60 yards and got Dad and brought him back. And Dad remembers that, coming back, and of course that man saved Dad's life. Now, Private Reed then attempted to go out and rescue some more wounded men. He wasn't successful. He brought another 1 or 2 back, but he was told to stay there and he wouldn't. And he went out again and he was killed.
A very interesting coincidence you might like to know about is about the same time as the time we're describing here, 28th of June in fact, a Victoria Cross was won just over behind us near that church steeple. That's the town of Merris, and on the 28th of June, the 10th Battalion, also part of the 1st Division, put in a battalion attack on the town. They were forming up to attack, and the Germans had brought a machine gun forward and fired right into their assembly area. Things were looking pretty grim indeed, and the only thing that saved the day was the actions of Corporal Phil Davey, who single-handedly went up, attacked the gun, threw grenades at it, and then replenished with bombs. He continued to attack the gunners and the reinforcements who'd come forward to support it. He killed a total of about 8 Germans and disrupted and defeated their attempt to destroy the battalion's assembly for their attack. It was described as one of the best VCs of the war by none other than Arthur Blackburn, also of the 10th Battalion, who went on to become quite a famous man after the war.
Tydencott Cemetery in Belgium is located on the site where 5 German blockhouses were captured by the 2nd Division on the 4th of October 1917. This is the largest British cemetery, holding almost 12,000 graves, of which 1,368 are Australian. The Cross of Sacrifice was built over one of the blockhouses. The members of our tour gather around the graves of Australian VC winners who are buried here. Captain Jeffries VC of the 34th Battalion, and Sergeant McGee VC of the 40th Battalion.
Well, we're here at Tydencott Cemetery and we're visiting the grave of my great-uncle Harry Maston. Sergeant Harry Maston joined in, I think, April of 1915 and went to Gallipoli in August of that year. He was with the 3rd Battalion, AIF, and after Gallipoli, of course, they came across to this part of the world, and he fought with the 3rd through the Somme, of 1916. He was at Pozieres. At Bullecourt, he won a military medal. He'd seen Ridge just up the hill up there. So it's really a very special privilege for me to be here once again, my second visit to Uncle Harold, and to say g'day and to thank him as well as all of these others for the contribution they've made. Thank you, Harold.
These are all artillery shells in front of us. They're all gaily painted, but they're painted these colours for a particular reason. These are all actually gas shells, one of the more lethal weapons of the war. The blue cross, the yellow cross and the green cross, that they signify mustard gas, phosgene gas and chlorine gas. The different colours represented a different shell, so they knew what type of shell they were actually firing. Oh, that's a German gas. All those across there, they're German gas masks. This is a really, really good selection of hand grenades and rifle grenades from the First World War.
Villers-Bretonneux, which is just outside Ypres. And we're looking at a series of bunkers that would have been storage and ammunition bunkers. This is in the Ypres salient, and to my front is Ypres, and the clock tower is in the distance, and that shows just how close we are. In the salient, they were fired on from 3 sides while defending this area. These bunkers are now home to a family of goats, but in 1917 they were part of that major battle that took so many lives. As we look around now, it is beautiful, peaceful farmland.
Except for the period of the German occupation in World War II, the last post has been played here each evening at the Melon Gate since 1928 to honour those who have no known grave in Belgium. Our tour provided the honour guard for the service, as well as having Philip Durston recite the ode on behalf of all on the tour.
Nor the years content. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.
We have kept our word. We've returned to Rookwood Cemetery after our long trip to France for the first ever ANZAC Dawn Service. A very memorable occasion it was as well. We visited many of the graves over in France and Belgium, and we are coming back here now to visit the graves in Rookwood Cemetery. This is a grave for Lance Corporal H. Perkins of the 18th Battalion, who was buried here on the 12th of December 1919, just 1 year and 1 month after the end of the war in France. The group from our other ANZAC Day tour have put forward a wreath that will lie on this grave, representing all those graves all over Australia. We would have liked us to lay a wreath on behalf of all of those that came back and may have been forgotten, but we hope not. this is our small effort to support all these men that went over there and fought for Australia and for the free world. We know there will be many, many people who will visit them overseas. Let's hope that many start visiting the graves back here in Australia.